After a year of fruitless peace negotiations with Vladimir Putin, the US seems resolved now to use rather sticks than carrots in its relations with the Kremlin. And to talk about this apparent U-turn in the American approach to Russia, we're joined by Philippe Dickinson, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council. Good evening.
Pleasure to join you.
So Donald Trump does not believe in the Ukrainian attack on Putin's residence and is also ready to go with the secondary sanctions on Russia's energy sector. Now, do you think it is the president's New Year's resolution to deal with Russia differently than in 2025?
Well, I hope that the president is going to be taking a continued and strong approach to dealing with Vladimir Putin throughout 2026. I think we've seen many examples over the years that Vladimir Putin is not somebody who can be trusted, is not somebody who acts in good faith and acts with deep cynicism. So some of these actions that the US administration is taking are certainly very welcome. I think the important thing is to maintain a unity across the NATO alliance, to maintain a consistency in messaging and a consistently firm approach in dealing with the Kremlin.
Oh, we'll talk about the unity among NATO members in a moment, but do you think that the US will finally impose 500% tariffs on countries buying energy from Russia, as it stands in Lindsey Graham's bill?
Well, Lindsey Graham is a senator who has a lot of influence with the White House and a lot of influence within the Republican Party. That kind of messaging is certainly very helpful. But these things often, they take time to negotiate and to, as we've seen with the tariff situation throughout the course of last year, nothing is set in stone when it comes to tariffs, and it's really a leverage kind of tactic that the administration and President Trump in particular likes to use. He certainly threatened to use the secondary sanctions against countries like India and others who have been purchasing Russian oil. This is something that I think would send a strong and welcome message to both to the Kremlin and to those countries that are helping to facilitate the Russian war machine in Ukraine.
It was described by the author of the bill as a bone-crushing message. Now, talking about messages, what sort of a message the US is sending to Vladimir Putin by boarding the Bela 1 oil tanker sailing under the Russian flag and escorted by a Russian submarine?
Well, hopefully a strong one. And a belated one, I think, a necessarily strong message to Russia. Vladimir Putin has been thumbing his nose up at the international system and at international law for years now. The Russian use of the shadow fleet has been ongoing for years to evade sanctions. An action to confront Russia's use of the shadow fleet has been somewhat lacking over the years. I think this is a really welcome move from the Trump administration to show that Russia's attempts to evade sanctions in this manner, that those days are numbered. And again, it goes back to the wider piece that the messaging towards Russia needs to be strong. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be backed up by action that the US has taken. It was supported by the UK in this move. And I would really encourage all allies to really consistently constrict any Russian attempts to use the shadow fleet to evade sanctions against Venezuela, sanctions against Russia and Iran and others. This is a really important tool for the international community to tackle this malign activity.
Let's talk about Ukraine for a while now. What do you think of the latest reports on the shape of security guarantees for Ukraine? Because it seems that the Europeans were hoping that the US would be ready to respond militarily in case of a Russian attack, which apparently is not the case.
I think it's something that the Europeans would hope for, but the consistent messaging from the Trump administration has been not to expect boots on the ground from the US military. The agreements that the French and British governments and the others in the coalition of the willing have come to with Ukraine are certainly very encouraging. but a lot is to be, the devil is always in the detail around the financing, the structure, the timeline, the command structure for any French, British, or other coalition of willing forces that are in Ukraine. And as for the US, again, positive noises from Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff about the progress in talks. But until everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. And it's important to maintain the energy and vigor with which we can pursue those agreements, and securing US support for things like critical enablers like airlift and communications, provision of critical equipment that only the United States can really provide. That is as important as anything as boots on the ground kind of messaging goes. But then, of course, we have to think about the sequencing of all of this. It needs to start with a ceasefire. That ceasefire needs to be agreed. And as we discussed earlier, Vladimir Putin certainly doesn't seem to be in any mood to end the war soon.
So no American boots on the ground in Ukraine, but what about Iran? Is the US about to strike Iran again? And given the recent protests in Iran, could Russia soon lose yet another ally after the capture of Venezuela's Maduro?
Look, it's been a busy start to 2026 in foreign policy, and I think the action against President Maduro in Venezuela has really got people imagining of a really broad swath of different action that the administration can take. I think we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves and imagine that there is going to be some imminent US military action against Iran. The strike on the nuclear facilities last year was a different matter. I think it's important to focus on showing support to the Iranian protesters who are heroically resisting the Iranian regime and the illegal actions of the Iranian regime. But speculating on what military strikes the US may or may not take next is perhaps getting a bit too carried away when it's been 3 or 4 days since the capture of President Maduro. There's a long way to go in 2026 yet.
Now, what do you make of the US oil giant Chevron making a bid for Russia's Lukoil foreign assets that would provide the Putin's regime with additional 22 billion euros? That's a lot in terms of waging a war with Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely. But I think the whole Western world needs to be united in its stance towards the Russian regime, both on government levels, and corporations need to be doing everything that we all can do to limit any support to the Russian government whatsoever. And that includes, obviously, energy. The European Union has taken really strong steps over the last year to wean itself off reliance on Russian energy. And it's important that every major global corporate player also plays their part and plays their part also in helping to crack down on Russian evasion of sanctions.
I have one more question, briefly, please. Now, after Donald Trump's remarks on Greenland, now also Portugal is afraid that the US is about to acquire the archipelago of the Azores. So, is this something that Donald Trump wanted to achieve? Well, basically, mistrust between the US and its NATO allies.
I don't think President Trump wants to achieve mistrust. I think President Trump has a consistent approach to how he deals with all international partners, friend or foe, as he has said, which is to keep people off balance, keep people guessing, and in doing so, you gain leverage in negotiations with whichever partner that is. And it certainly seems to be his approach, including in dealing with Europe. But Europe has handled the Trump administration pretty well throughout 2025, and I think we shouldn't get too kind of panicked or worried about what might happen next. The important thing is to maintain this consistent engagement with the Trump administration and with other figures across US politics. You saw earlier some really strong statements from Republicans in Congress, and I think that there is disquiet amongst the Republican Party about, threats or speculation that, toppling Nicolas Maduro is one thing, but going after and threatening NATO allies is a very different thing. And I think we need to maintain a sense of calm that the US political system will continue to work through these issues.
Philippe Dickinson, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for more interviews and news here on TVP World.